Okay, so Scott is back and he's been under the tinfoil hat for most of the last fortnight, and we've got a lot to unpack about the Great Reset. Thank you very much for coming back to talk to me again, Scott.
No worries, Ash. Thanks for having me. So it's 2030, you own nothing, you have no privacy, and you've never been happier. You excited?
I'm terrified.
Yeah, me too.
So, so what is the Great Reset? What is it?
So it's it's a policy put out by a group called the World Economic Forum. So they are, I guess, a think tank, sort of a mega think tank, really. They meet in Davos, in Switzerland every year.
Good
It's
skiing,
a
yeah.
good skiing in Davos. I suspect that's why they have it. I think a lot of security as well. Very easy to fortify. But so it's a meeting of world leaders, business leaders, but mostly bankers. I think the leaders are there to tell the bankers what they're going to do, and the bankers are there to tell them whether or not it'll work. So anyway, it's by the World Economic Forum. There's a big spooky guy in charge of them, but I don't really want to focus on him. They've sort of been the think tank that's behind things like globalization, things like the World Bank, sort of this global trade thing, knocking down international borders. They're basically there to try and stimulate the world economy and figure out ways to do that. They're not really that interested in the little people. And yeah, whether or not China is their new best friend, maybe. They're certainly giving these business leaders a lot of very, very cheap labor. So who knows? But that's sort of the backstory.
So I'm hearing bankers, I'm
Yeah,
hearing open borders, I'm hearing fortified security in a remote location. It sounds rather sinister, doesn't it?
certainly does. Certainly does. I mean, if there's lizard people, they're definitely there. At the end of the day, it's really easy to think that these people want to do evil things and be in control of everyone. I think it's much simpler to just read it as these people want to make as much money as possible, and they want to avoid the sort of stuff we were talking about last time, where all the wealth gets wiped out from everyone and we all start over. That's one of the really interesting things about this great reset. I haven't heard any mention of what they're resetting. They're certainly not resetting the wealth.
Well, that's what I'm hearing too. I mean, just on a side note, if they want to improve their image, I think maybe they should have the meeting in a water park in Hawaii. I mean, that might be a little more, might be better
Yeah,
marketing for them.
yeah, or like, maybe some sort of a democratic process might be nice, or taking some influence from some regular people. And this is sort of the issue with these technocrats and these globalists at the end of the day. They go to their own private schools, they're sort of marked at birth to be leaders, and they have very little contact with the regular people in any country.
So what's a technocrat?
So the technocratic movement is sort of something that arose out of, like we were talking about last time, the last peak debt period in sort of the 1920s through the 1930s. And there was a really strong belief, particularly in Russia, later the Soviet Union, but also in Germany, that the problem with the economy was not uh, anything anything that couldn't be fixed if we just had more data. There's this really strong feeling that we can fix everything in the economy if we just know exactly what everyone is doing at all times.
Well, some people would argue that that's true because, I mean, Ray Dalio said that one of the reasons why economics is failing, the average Joe around the world is because we're not measuring, enough data points. We're not really seeing how everybody's going. And is that what they're trying to do? They're trying to collect data to try and set economic policy more efficiently, or what are they doing? What's the plan around the data?
Yeah, I think that's part of the plan. There's a big upswelling for central bank digital currencies at the moment. The idea that citizens will have a bank account at the central bank, and the central bank can just credit you some money. Say there's a recession, everyone needs some stimulus money. go to your so in Australia, the RBA account, and the RBA gives you some money directly, means they can do that without going through the commercial banks and having to hope that the commercial banks lend it out. They can just say, here's some money, go spend it. And they can also do things like forcing you to spend it onshore instead of offshore, forcing you to spend it with a time limit. But that seems to be the rails
But they can do that now.
well, that's the thing. They can do that now in Australia. And we have to always remember that Australia truly is the lucky country. We've got a very small population, and we got to have a look at what failed in the UK and the US and Europe before we built our stuff. So we got things like digital money much earlier than a lot of the rest of the Western world. We got things like direct social security accounts. But if you have a look at what happened in America during the virus at the start, they tried to get the people money and they just couldn't.
So you've got an organization consisting of bankers and world leaders who are already very wealthy, who are already disconnected from society because they had different education to, the middle and lower classes, if you want to call it that. And this organization is saying that it is incentivized to protect the wealth of society when already the people in this organization have benefited from the wealth concentration. I mean, how do you explain that? There's a conflict of interest there.
Yeah, there's a very big conflict of interest. I guess the thought process goes, there's only really two ways to redistribute wealth properly. We already saw the failed way to redistribute wealth, give money out to people. That just ended up in Jeff Bezos's account and, by extension, back to China that manufactures all of his goods. So that didn't seem to redistribute anything. The only two ways to redistribute wealth is large-scale wealth destruction. So historically, it's pandemics and war. And this war, if we do it, it's either going to take out the internet.
So what war are you talking about?
I mean, the only war that seems to really be on the table is US-China. They could either do it directly, or more likely it's going to be fought over Southeast Asian countries, places like Vietnam, Taiwan,
the Pacific.
But at the end of the day, I don't think the Chinese particularly want to wipe out a whole bunch of wealth, and I don't think that the people at the World Economic Forum would like to wipe out wealth at this point. It sort of only ends with the destruction of the internet, which will cripple global business, or nuclear bombs.
But it's funny you say nuclear bombs, because the internet was designed primarily to be a form of communication in the event of a nuclear attack. The idea of packet routing, weaving its way through, alternative routes of communication. But it wouldn't, when you say wipe out the internet, are you talking about a physical conflict wiping out the internet? Or are you talking about maybe the increased control of the data, the censorship, all that sort of stuff? What are you referring to with the internet being wiped out?
So if we are having an internet war, it probably looks like an information war, and arguably we're already in the middle of an information war at the moment.
So coming back to the Great Reset. So the Great Reset is about tapping more information, acquiring more information on your citizenry in order to create better outcomes. But yet, if you were to collect that data, wouldn't that make it more vulnerable to cyber attacks and subversive actions by another nation?
It certainly would, and I think part of the rationale of the Great Reset plan to get us through the next couple of decades hinges on smart cities being a big part of it. So think of the smart cities as digital citadels. If you've got all of your production in a city, you can firewall it off from the rest of the world pretty readily, and you can monitor the information coming in and out over the internet much more easily than you can with a big distributed network across a whole country.
What sort of information would they be recording or storing?
Well, if it gets to the stage of some of the World Economic Forum propaganda, yeah, that's exactly what they're talking about. the idea that you don't actually own anything anymore. All that you need is just provided by the city that you live in. So yeah, they would need to have really good information on what people eat, where they travel to, how much greenhouse emissions they're putting out during their activities. I would imagine it's fairly comprehensive.
Okay, so obviously it's good that they're sort of trying to price externalities, right? Like pollution. But what you're talking about sounds like a global rollout of an AI controlled communism.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like that. I
Sounds?
yeah, it's exactly that. Let's face it, it's exactly a global rollout of communism. I think one of the interesting things to note is that the Americans have basically created as a uh, a natural phenomenon communism within their capital markets. They have
Yeah.
a couple of giant firms that own 5% of everything, BlackRock and Vanguard. So they're the ones that create the ETFs, the exchange traded funds. They basically own a little bit of everything. And if you don't want to do uh, any sort of choice within your investment, you just buy some of that and your money is invested.
So what's the connection between BlackRock, Vanguard, and the Great Reset?
That's a really interesting one. So a lot of the commentary that I've read on this stuff is talking about how the executives at BlackRock, because they own 5% of essentially every asset on Earth, they're every major company's CEO's boss, basically. They're a large chunk of the shareholders. They can call up any CEO, any board member in the world and say, do this, don't do that, tell us what you're going to do. We don't like you, get out.
Can you give us an example of where they've used their muscle against a business? You don't have to tell me the business's name.
I'm not sure of a concrete example. This stuff is very cloak and dagger, as you'd imagine. One of the interesting concepts that I came across was the idea of free vaccines. So we're looking at these large biotech companies potentially doing either very cheap or free vaccines, and that doesn't seem to make a very good business case for, say, Pfizer or Moderna to put out this medicine for free. But if you look at it as the boss of these companies is BlackRock, it makes a lot more sense if you're acting in the best interest of the shareholder. BlackRock makes more money when the world economy is working, so their best interest is served by getting this damn vaccine out as quickly as possible and getting back to business.
Obviously, I've got concerns about the vaccine more broadly, but just forgetting about that, is that part of the Great Reset that there's some sort of way that they're setting up the incentives so that companies do more altruistic things that other than create profits? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, there's a big part of the Great Reset propaganda that's talking about stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder capitalism. So the concept behind stakeholder capitalism is that you're not only trying to benefit the shareholders, but because the society that you operate in has a stake in how your company operates, then you owe it to the society you operate in to take their interests uh, into mind. It's really clearly demonstrated when you think about that BlackRock as the major shareholder of the company concept. But I think more broadly, the World Economic Forum is getting to the point where they realize if they keep pushing this shareholder profit as the number one and only thing that a company is measured by, they're going to have a lot of pitchforks and torches pretty quickly.
The free market capitalists would argue that the profit motive is what creates all of this innovation. The profit motive is what allows people to strive for better products, services, outcomes in the first place. And if you really think about it, this BlackRock being invested in making the vaccine free, that's still the profit motive. Why does the Great Reset need to create some sort of artificial metric to measure how our society is being benefited?
Well, like you said, the free market capitalists are very keen on the profit motive being the best driver of innovation, and I tend to agree with them. The issue comes when you get to the stage of declining businesses. So oil companies are the number one example. They have a profit motive still, but there's no clear way that they can actually achieve good profits. So they kind of get to the point of having a perverse incentive to just stop anyone else from knocking over their business at this point. I think this is part of what the Great Reset is supposed to address, the idea that if your business is done, you need to step away from it.
So the Great Reset is about trying to price negative externalities, perverse incentives, bad behavior at the end of the business cycle by businesses that are going offline. Are there other examples of the World Economic Forum trying to create these metrics that they can roll out so that larger businesses can adopt them for the benefit of society?
They've sort of been struggling with this for the last few years. BlackRock's CEO, I can't recall his full name. His last name's Dees. He's just been mooted as one of the uh, Biden economic team members recently. He had a good go at it. The World Economic Forum's had a go at it over the last couple of years. New Zealand has a draft of something that would look like sort of a societal wellness scale rather than
Right.
a balance sheet number. It's a very tricky thing to try and calculate because these people think in numbers only. So the idea of trying to put a number on the general wellness of your society, very difficult to do.
But isn't that what a democracy is for? I mean, when your society starts to get sick, you vote out the government that has the policies that are creating that damage. I mean, I know we've got a situation in Australia where a lot of people are voting, a party in to protect people's wealth, to inflate house prices, that sort of thing. So it doesn't always work. But generally, isn't that what democracy is supposed to do?
You followed the US elections coverage. Do you think democracy is still working particularly well everywhere?
But that's America is a complex country. I mean, a part of their problem is just the free market capitalists would probably agree with me there. They've got too many levels of government. They've got too many, each state is a sovereign entity. I mean, that introduces, complexities that are very hard to overcome. They've got a lot of intervention in a lot of their market, in a lot of their free markets. I mean, that's not just a democracy thing with America.
It's not just a democracy thing, but I don't think you can point at America and say democracy is getting us out of this situation. I don't think you can point at Europe and say democracy is functioning particularly well over there either. Most of the parliaments over there are just splintered into 5 or 6 parties that can't figure out how to do anything, and there doesn't seem to be anyone home in Brussels at the European Union most of the time. South America's been having just constant protests for the last couple of years. Australia seems to be Australia and New Zealand seem to be some of the better functioning democracies. I suppose Japan sort of is still working. It's kind of a one-party system a little bit.
So does that mean that the Great Reset, they're trying to replace democracy?
I thought that at the start. I'm not certain that that's actually the plan. I think it's more along the lines of the special economic zones that China has been having a lot of success with. So China, sort of 10, maybe 20 years ago, started updating their economic model and doing special economic zones where they would pool investment and try and really generate geographically located growth. It's basically based off the American model where you rotate around cities and you have really good growth in some cities like Silicon Valley and now Denver and Austin are sort of the new cities. You burn them out as you need to and you move on to another city, have some more economic growth there, and it kind of all just keeps going.
And why are they focusing on cities?
Cities have always had a really special part in industrial culture. That was always the very first part of getting from agrarian culture to some kind of industrial culture, bring everyone in off the farms, make the farms more streamlined and more efficient, and have the people doing higher value work in the cities. So it's sort of the only economic model we've seen work. I guess we can kind of ape it with this distributed work from home thing, but at some point you're going to need people to work in some factories, run the ports, run the financial district.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I read somewhere that one of the reasons why we have environmental issues is that people living in cities is actually terribly inefficient. So when a city hits a certain number of people, I think it's 2 million is the number, maybe 1.5 million, I don't know, but the amount of energy that's used to sustain that society goes up exponentially, or goes up parabolically up to a certain point. And you'd think that maybe a lot of the issues with inefficiency would be remedied by this work from home situation. I mean, there's less cars driving around. The offices consume a lot of power to maintain temperature. That a lot of the environmental issues would be addressed by just the work from home on its own. I mean, why do we need Great Reset to go and automate all of the cities to, you don't own your house, you don't own your bed, you don't use time to share your living room. I mean, why do we need all of this, why do we need the Great Reset with what's happened?
I think we really need to remember that Australia is a bit of a unique place. We probably don't need this in Australia. We can probably figure out a decent way to sort this stuff out for ourselves. But down in Buenos Aires, across India, they're going to need some help.
What are some of the objections that you see to this? I mean, it sounds to anyone that it's like a global rollout of artificial intelligence driven communism. What are some of the other objections people see? Is it the lizard people? Is it, the Rothschilds? What are some of the objections to the Great Reset?
I mean, it does get deep in the sort of lizard people, Rothschilds type stuff, doesn't it? Yeah, people hate the idea of not owning their stuff. People hate the idea.
I hate it.
Yeah, I hate it too. People hate the idea of time sharing their living room with some business. We're going to need to figure out some sort of way to organize society. Consumer goods have basically hit zero marginal cost at this point. Are we going to just consume as much plastic as we want for another couple of decades?
What does zero marginal cost mean?
Zero marginal cost means you pay someone in China a couple of cents to bang out whatever piece of plastic you need and ship it over to you for $1, and there you go. What even is the point of charging for these consumer items anymore? Wouldn't we be better off pooling them, having them available on demand, and recycling them within our community?
How does this tie into the Jeff Bezos issue, where we've got the stimulus money from the pandemic being spent on consumer items, and that winds up being, the profit goes to Jeff Bezos, and the manufacturing goes to China? I mean, is that an issue they're trying to address as well?
One of the thoughts that crossed my mind is another way that civilizations across history have tried to deal with these wealth inequality issues, and that's by having gigantic vanity projects as a redistribution method. So think the pyramids, think giant statues. At the end of the day, that's one gigantically wealthy person or one family deciding to build a giant vanity project and paying people or enslaving them in some cases. But so I think this is a potential outcome of having these trillionaires running around. Instead of incentivizing them to shoot rockets into space, let's say, hey, you want to buy Buenos Aires for $5 trillion and see if your technocratic AI can figure out how to run this society.
And is that part of the Great Reset doctrine?
It's not something that's directly been mentioned, but I think it's pretty clear from the subtext that these smart cities are going to need a gigantic amount of infrastructure spend. I don't think that these South American cities are going to be able to afford to put in a gigantic amount of infrastructure. I think India is going to need a lot of help to put in a lot of infrastructure. The best way that I can think of funding this stuff seeing as we have all these trillionaire IT guys running around thinking that they should probably run the world, why not give them a test run in some of these places?
Carnegie said that one of the definitions of capitalism, and this was ideas around the same time as Henry George and Karl Marx and all of those thinkers, maybe a bit after, I can't remember. But he said that the solution for the wealth inequality that capitalism creates is not the wealth inequality itself, it's the lifestyle and the life trajectory of the people that create these massive fortunes. So what he basically said was that if someone does amass huge amounts of wealth, they do it before they're 50 or 40 or whatever, but then what they do is they take the ideal thing for these people to do is to take time off for the rest of their lives, enjoy their wealth, but also become philanthropic. And that's what we've seen with people like Bill Gates. And I know there's issues around that people are concerned about. But yeah, I'm trying to dodge this topic and maybe ask it as a singular question. But
No, I think it's useful to point out Bill Gates. He's certainly got a few problematic issues about him, to say the least.
oh, the difference of opinion there is the same as the differences of opinion with Trump. I mean, that's a very polarizing topic.
Yeah, and don't say Soros's name.
No, well, you said it. It's already happened. The
They're
keyword
onto
is,
us.
Google is going to register that as a keyword, and it's going to come up alongside the lizard people videos. But that's what the Great Reset is. Another aspect of the Great Reset. So it's an extension of this idea that the billionaire class or the trillionaire class should use their wealth not for sending rockets to Mars or low Earth orbit or whatever it is, but they should focus on smart cities and AI and that sort of thing. That's the idea.
Yeah, and it comes back to sort of the start of the American project. If you give governments a whole bunch of money and bail out their debt over time, they kind of just build big armies and then fight each other and then bail out their debt and then start again. That's the only solution they have to wealth inequality. If you give the wealthy in your society an incentive to do something for the good of society, it might work out. Now, the World Economic Forum doesn't have a particularly good track record of things working out particularly well, but remember that governments and think tanks and global bodies, they're unintended consequence machines. You can have the best of intentions and something completely absurd pops out the other side. But at the end of the day, it road to hell, exactly. But we can't just sit around and not do anything while climate change just burns us all alive. And I think if you can put down some smart cities, if you can have democratic fundamentals behind them, you can have optional citizenship of these cities. So these are the rules, this is the level of surveillance, will provide you with a very good level of comfort, will provide you with a very good level of security, will provide you with a good level of economic opportunity, but these are the rules. It might just create some islands of stability in these continents that have just been complete basket cases for 50, 60, 80 years.
And so it sounds like that these cities also want that they're going to be carbon sinks. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not really sure on how this decarbonization stuff is going to work. Like, India's planting a hell of a lot of trees, but we're going to need to figure out some kind of carbon capture thing. It kind of reminds me of the latest Chinese 5-year plan that sort of said, we're going to go it alone. And I know you're all worried about food, but don't worry, we'll invent something magical to make sure that we have enough food.
You can create carbon sinks in so many ways. I mean, you can have Blade Runner style mega structures sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere. You could create genetically engineered algae that is ferociously addicted to carbon and sucks it out and converts it into something else. You could just localize manufacturing so you don't have gigantic super tankers or ships pumping carbon into the atmosphere going all across the world. I mean, you don't need that's right. You don't need a smart city to solve that problem.
No, but you do need to have a stable economy. You can't have everyone in constant political schism if you're trying to do genetically modified algae across the entire world. There needs to be some level of economic stability somewhere to foster that entrepreneurial development.
So it sounds like it's a resilience thing. So what the resilience idea is that they're trying to create, like you say, stable economic zones that are service-based, opt-in, where the goal is to have better democratic outcomes, less rent seeking, less rent seeking because there's no ownership, all that sort of stuff. Is that what I'm hearing? They're trying to recreate society in special areas and just see how it goes.
I mean, that's my interpretation of the propaganda that's been put out. They've certainly not committed to it being democratic. They've certainly not committed to it being opt-in. But reading between the lines, if I was doing it and I wanted it to be somewhat stable and functional, that's the sort of thing that I would be thinking about. I don't think it's going to go down very well if you just trot into a democratic city and say, oh, by the way, we're in charge now, we've bought all your land, and you don't get to vote on who's in charge. I don't think that's going to work out very well.
Well, given that all the land on planet Earth is owned, as far as I know, I mean, obviously there's a 1% somewhere that's not, but or maybe more, but the open ocean and international territories, what are they going to do? Build floating cities, off the coast of in international waters? I mean, where are they going to procure this land? Have they already set their target on a place or a region?
Oh, there's a list of the smart cities that have been proposed. There's a list of 100 cities proposed in India, so that gives you an idea of the scale. That program is done under the Indian government itself, so they've figured that this is what they want to do and they want to maintain sovereignty over it. But I imagine some of the smart cities that will pop up in Africa and South America will be much less of a sovereign project and much more of a public-private partnership, the the biggest unintended consequence machine of them all.
Reminds me of Robocop 3, where they had Delta City at the end. So I think
Yeah.
it was early 90, it was like 93 or something. There was Robocop 3 and Omni Consumer Products, which was like the epitome of a sort of a diabolical, um, incompetent corporation, was going to tear down Detroit and replace it with this technologically advanced city with droids. And these sort of ideas have been floating around for a while. I mean, in Australia we had the multifunctional polis in the 90s, or it was the 80s, I can't remember. But so these aren't really new ideas. This is basically just sounds like it's a rebranding of ideas that have been floating around our society for a while.
So yeah, these ideas aren't particularly new. They were really popular in the 1930s through to about the 1950s. They sort of they caught on in the Soviet Union and Germany and got exported from Germany across to the west coast of America at the end of World War II. And I think this is one of the things that the World Economic Forum is really looking out for, that during these times of economic tightness, uh, the idea that the world is overpopulated or there's some great calamity ahead of us and we need to do something really extreme always pops up. And it had really disastrous and toxic results when it was pushed into the liberal mainstream on the west coast of America in the 50s and the 60s.
Well, the problem as I see it with the world is not smart cities and things like that. It's basically the finance system preventing a deleveraging event. Most of the inequality problems are being caused by that we're at the end, where there's less of the credit cycle in front of us than behind us, and they're just trying to, as people say, kick the can down the road. I mean, that's where the problems are coming from. So is this trying to solve that problem as well?
I totally agree with you that kicking the can down the road has got us here, and we're at the end of this debt cycle, and that's the real problem that needs to be addressed. The problem is that you can either have a giant deleveraging event that throughout history has only ever ended up in mass unemployment or war or famine, it's never good to have a big deleveraging event. It does clear, but it takes a long time, and you have to put a lot of resources into kickstarting your economy again. The other option is to inflate away all the debt like the world did in the 70s. And that works just fine, but you create these gigantically wealthy people. And arguably, we probably don't have enough fiscal space to give Jeff Bezos another 3 zeros at the end of his bank account.
But Jeff Bezos is poor compared to other people in history. I mean, if you
Well,
look at hundreds of years ago, there were people, I mean, the robber barons of America, and they had another zero on their wealth, relatively speaking, I think, or a couple of zeros.
yeah, they did have another zero on their wealth, but they didn't have access to intercontinental rocket technology.
Right.
That's sort of the issue. We've got a finite amount of resources, and you can say whether or not this climate change stuff is as bad as it is put to be, but resources are finite. I think we can all agree on that. If you inflate away the debt, we're going to dig up pretty much the rest of the world's resources and shoot them into space in the next decade, I think. So we're really closely confined on a lot of sides, and we don't have a lot of good options to actually reset this debt in some way that's going to work out particularly well. So I agree
So,
with that.
so it sort of reminds me of sort of maybe a child that's having a tantrum, and you got the parent that's sick of it, that says go to your room, so you got the world with all this debt and inequality and the asset inequality and the asset economy being disconnected from the rest of the real economy. And that's the screaming kid, and the screaming kid's being told to go to its room, and they're going to have a quiet dinner in a smart city where your living room is time shared and you don't own anything, and that's going to be like an alternative to.
Yeah, I mean it's not the best option either. I've like we said, because these sorts of globalist ideas are unintended consequence machines, I don't think we'll actually get up to the point where no one owns anything and you're time
No,
sharing your living room.
no.
But it at least communicates to business leaders and bankers that, hey guys, the world's going to be on fire if you keep going the way that you're going. So let's try something.
So the lizard people aren't involved. It's not the Rothschilds. This thing generated a lot of controversy because if you get people in a remote location, wall it off, and they're all bankers and politicians, people tend to react appropriately, in my opinion. But obviously, the content of what you've unpacked is this is basically an idea of how we can divert technocratic resources or wealth acquired by technocrats to create special economic zones where people have an alternative to opt out of the debt-based economy. But it's not going to happen because it's probably too complicated or too difficult, and you've got all sorts of other issues that might happen in some places, but at least it's raising awareness for the broader business community.
Yeah, and a lot of that is my interpretation of the things that they've said. I would anticipate that a lot of these cities will end up not being democratic, or not as democratic as we're used to. The other thing to remember is that it's all well and good for a 50-year-old to say, but I've worked really hard for 30 years for all this stuff. I don't want to give it up and go live in your smart city technocrat zone. But we've got a whole generation of millennials all across the West that haven't been able to do the careers that they wanted to do, to have the economic participation they wanted and they trained for. It sort of makes a bit of sense to me that, opting out might be a legitimate option for some of these people.
I know there's someone, Bitcoin is the way to opt out in a way, isn't it? I thought that was the opt out solution.
Yeah, I've been having a few conversations with Bitcoiners on Twitter this week. And yeah, they keep saying, oh, Bitcoin's a life raft. Bitcoin's your opt-out option. Stop these irresponsible governments. And I keep asking them, life raft to where? Where are you going?
Look, I quite like digital currency because I like the programmability of it. And digital scarcity is definitely a real thing, but the worry about the crypto stuff is that the central banks creating their own, and you're going to get this. You're going to use it. They're going to have access to that technology, which is a tremendous advancement in computer technology, and it's going to get in the hands of the people that arguably cause a lot of the problems.
Oh yeah, they're going to stuff it up. Like the first 10 years of central bank digital currencies are going to be an absolute disaster. But it doesn't mean the idea doesn't have some merit. I really don't like the idea of doing automated fining of citizens. I don't
No,
particularly like social credit, but it's worth noting that we had social credit in Australia back when Commonwealth Bank was a government-run community bank. That's essentially what social credit would be, and it didn't destroy society.
we have that now. We've got credit ratings. We've got
Yeah,
likes on Instagram. We've got shares on Facebook,
yeah,
impressions on Twitter.
and like and like you were saying, YouTube puts this video through their algorithm and picks up everything we've said. Your phone listens to you 24/7. Like we've already opted into a surveillance society. At least with the smart city, they're actually saying we're going to surveil you.
Yeah. Yeah, so they're being honest.
Yeah.
So you've got to give it to them. They're being honest.
I mean, it's an improvement on just tricking your mum into thinking she's just clicking on pictures of cats, right?
Yeah. What I've heard so far in this conversation is that the World Economic Forum have done an absolutely terrible marketing job. They have given the image that world leaders and bankers have met in the GoldenEye bunker in Davos to talk about rolling out communism with a AI-driven surveillance apparatus. And yeah, it sounds like that, and I'm a little bit scared of it. But do you think that this is a way to enslave humanity? Is this really a threat?
I mean, it could be. It could very well could be, but it's going to be pretty disruptive to roll out global enslavement. I think it's probably going to be a much better economic plan to just have special economic zones that are opt-in. That seems like the least disruptive version of this.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time tonight, Scott, and I hope the lizard people don't abduct you while you're sleeping this evening. And
Yeah, look, if I disappear, you know who took me.
oh yeah, and I've got video evidence too. It's recorded.
Thanks very much, Ash.
All right, have a lovely night.